Let's now learn about the very basics of CSS and make our web page look a little bit nicer. So as you probably already know, we use CSS to style elements and to create a layout for the overall page. And we can write CSS right here in the HTML file using the style element. Okay, and that style element is not for visible content here on the page, and so it should go right here into the head. Okay, because remember, the head is basically like for settings of the page, and the style definitely counts as a setting. So style, and now to style elements we need to first select them. And there are different types of selectors in CSS, and we're going to learn about a couple of them in this video and the next one. But the most basic one is the element selector. And with the element selector, we can simply select all elements of a certain type. For example, the body. So we write body and then curly braces. And then in here, we can write our CSS declarations. So each CSS declaration has a property name and then a value. For example, we can style the background color. So background color, and let me actually auto-complete it here. So background color is the property, and then let's say green. So in CSS, there are a couple of predefined color names, and we can then use these. Give it a save, and bam, our page is green now. So that's CSS for you. So we have the body element selector. Then all of this here is our declaration block. And this here is a simple declaration where background color is the property and green is the specified value. Now, usually we write our CSS in an external CSS file. So just like we write JavaScript in an external script, we do the same basically with CSS. So let's create that separate CSS file. So I'm bringing back the sidebar here using Command or Control B. And then let's call this one the style.css. Close the sidebar. And now we need to connect these two. So again, just like we had to connect the JavaScript file to the HTML, we also have to select the CSS. But it works a bit differently. So let's copy this here, or cut it here. So when I save it now, of course, it's gone, okay? And that's because the style file is not yet linked to the HTML. So we link it by using the link element. So that's not very creative. So here we use href again, which remember is the same attribute as in the anchor element here. Okay, but don't confuse anchor with link. So link does not create a clickable link, so like this. Instead, we use it only to basically link CSS files to HTML files. So here we say style.css because that's the name that we gave to the file. Okay, and then we also need to specify the rel attribute and set it to style sheet. Give it a save, and here we go. The green color is back. Okay, and so now we can write all our styles in the separate file here, and so we separated the presentation from the content. So let's actually make this like yellow, and we should probably give it a little bit a nicer color. And in VS Code, when you hover a color like this, you see this pop-up, which then allows you to select a color. And this is very handy. So let's do this, and then maybe just a very subtle color like this. All right, this looks a lot better already. Okay, so let's now explore some more CSS properties. For example, we can set the font family. And here we can start by setting it to a font that you probably have on your computer. And so Arial is probably one that you have. Now in practice, we use web fonts, for example, from a service like Google Fonts. Okay, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. So let's just give it a save. And so you now saw this font here changing. And on your system, that should work too. And if you don't have Arial, then just use some other fonts that you have available. But now you might ask, we set the font family on the body, right? So why did all these elements, like this H1 here and this P element and this H2 element, why did all of them get the Arial font as well? Well, that's because the font family property is a property that gets inherited, okay? So all the child elements of the body element will automatically get this font family assigned to them. And that makes it very handy so that we don't have to go ahead and set the font family separately on all these elements. So just setting this on the body will then set it on all the child elements. Now, most properties do actually not inherit, but generally all the properties that are related to fonts will inherit. So let's check out another one. Font size, and let's set it to 20 pixels. Give it a save, and you see that everything got a little bit bigger now. However, not all the elements have a font size of 20 pixels now. And that's because the elements like this H1 and this H2 have predefined font sizes that automatically are applied from the browser if we do not specify them on our own. Okay? But of course we can override them with our own selectors. So let's say H1, and so this is another element selector, and in this case, of course, it selects the H1 element. So let's say font size 50 pixels. And so take a look at this now. And well, that's huge. Let's make it a little bit smaller, maybe 40. Yeah, that looks about right. All right, and now let's actually use the class names and the IDs that we set in the previous lecture to now select elements based on these classes. So remember that here we set this paragraph to first and this one to second. So we basically named them like this. And in fact, let's go ahead and add another class here to this other paragraph. So class, and I will call this one first too. Okay, so remember, IDs have to be unique, so we can only use them once, but classes can be used multiple times. And so that's what we did here. And so now I can go ahead and select all the elements which have the first class, so this paragraph, and then style them however I want. And this will then only affect these two paragraphs, but not this one. Okay, because this one has the second class. So let me show that to you. And so the class selector is using the dot. So dot first. Okay, and so this is our selector. Dot is for the class, and then first is the class name. And so we set the text color using the color property. And let's set it to red, give it a save, and what do you think will happen now? That's right. This paragraph and this one, which are the two paragraphs which have the first class, are now red. But this other paragraph is of course not red because we didn't select it here. Okay, and so this CSS rule here does not apply to it. Finally, let's also format or form. So let's check that out. And so here we have this your name ID, right? So we already know how to select based on the class name. And so let's now learn how to select based on ID. And it's very similar, but instead of the dot, we use the hash. So hash your name, I think that was the ID, right? Yes, your name. So let's set a different background color here. And I will again use this trick where I can now set the color using this pop-up window. So that's a trick I like to use. Let's make it similar, but a little bit darker. Yes, that looks nice. And we will make it even nicer in the next lecture after we learn about the box model. But for now, this looks good already. So another one that we can use here is the border property. And the border property is a so-called shorthand property, because here we can set multiple values for just one property. So for the border, we can set the width, so basically the thickness of the border. So let's say 5 pixels. Then we can set the style of the border, and let's make it solid, but we could also make it dotted or dashed, but that would look a little bit like weird. And then the color. So until now, we have always used CSS color names or this RGB format like this. But of course, CSS also accepts RGB colors. So for that, we use the hash, and then let's use 444 as this dark gray. So you see this is dark gray, but we could of course change it again using this pop-up. Okay, but let's leave it here with the RGB code, give it a save, and here you see this nice border around the form. Okay, so again, this border is a shorthand property because it allows us to specify multiple values here like this. You can also notice that this property is not inherited, right? So unlike the font family or the font size, because if it was inherited, then now all these child elements here would have a 5 pixel border around them as well, right? So this one and this one, but they do not. And well, in this case, it wouldn't make sense. And so that's why border is not inherited. Okay, and this should be enough for one lecture. In the next one, we will learn about the box model so that we can then add some spacing here. For example, some spacing here inside of this box to give it some space here and also some space between these elements. So stay tuned for that and see you in the next lecture.